You've been told that short term rentals are the fast track to passive income. And maybe you've seen the Instagram reels, the luxury cabins, the pickleball courts, those 50K months. What nobody's showing you is the investor on the other side of that deal quietly losing money every single month. Today, I'm talking to Kirby Atwell from Living Off Rentals, and he's going to flip everything you think you know about short term rentals upside down. So let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to Passively Rich with Rentals. You guys, today I have a very exciting interview. We are talking short term rentals with Kirby Atwell from the podcast Living Off of Rentals. Welcome to the show, Kirby.
Thanks. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, so you guys, I'm gonna let you in on a little bit of secret. I was just being interviewed by Kirby on his podcast, and we are going back to back. And now I am interviewing him, and I am so excited to dive in. So, Kirby, if you don't mind, give us your background, give us your bio, tell us everything that you are doing right now. Fill us in.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of start from the beginning. So I left the military back in 2011. I'd gone to West Point and served as a army officer for 6 years after that. And while I was in the army, I picked up the little purple gateway drug into real estate investing, Rich Dad Poor Dad, which seems to be kind of like the entry point for a lot of people. And I read that in 2006, and I was kind of like, I was always entrepreneurial minded, but I didn't know what direction I wanted to go. And then after reading that, I was like, all right, real estate is what I want to do. And so bought a couple rentals while I was in the army, not knowing what I was doing at all. And I thought, when I leave the army in 2011, I'm going to jump into this and just do real estate full time, make a ton of money, be a success story. And that's not exactly how it worked. So I got out and didn't qualify for financing. There was no such thing as a DSCR loan back then. It was basically just commercial loans and residential conventional loans. And I didn't have an income anymore. So I was like, I guess flipping is what I'm going to do. And so I partnered with some friends and we started a flipping company in Chicago. And we flipped about 70 houses around the Chicagoland area initially from 2011 to 2016. And we started with more like mid-range houses, working class area. Like they sold well, hit our numbers. And we kept thinking, well, we need to do more deals because we always kind of like felt like we're not making much. Like we made money, but then it went right back into the business. So we thought if we get into luxury deals, then the numbers are much bigger, even if the margins are the same, the percentage is the same. What we didn't realize is like a luxury refrigerator doesn't cost twice as much. It costs 10 times as much. And there's a much smaller buyer pool, and that buyer pool is much more picky. So like your inspections come back and they want $50,000 of repairs, not 5,000. And so it didn't work out exactly as planned. We still made some money on those properties, but after 5 years of doing this and 70 deals, I realized I was pretty much in the exact same spot financially as when we started because we just kept building this machine that was like this treadmill, where we would do a deal, make some money, put it back in the business, do some more marketing, buy another deal, take on all that risk. Sometimes they went well, sometimes they didn't. Worked with a lot of different contractors and could never get ahead. And the whole reason I wanted to get into real estate was financial freedom in the first place. And so that's when I transitioned into rentals, initially longer term rentals, and then found this very specific short term rental niche that I'm in now.
Okay. You covered so many things there. That was perfect. I'm like dying to kind of go into it. So, and you live in Indiana, right?
I do. Yeah. I'm from Chicago originally. Now I'm in Northwest Indiana, which really it's an hour outside of Chicago. So it's kind of like a suburb, really.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, how on earth did you discover this short-term rental world? Like what year are we talking and how did you dip your foot into that and went, "Aha, this might be the piece that was missing."
So 2016 is really when I kind of wanted to transition out of flipping. My partners wanted to keep doing it. I said, God bless you. I'm going to just basically start over from scratch. You guys can have the company and I'm going to start doing some rentals and trying to build cash flow. So I did some long-term rentals and then we moved over to Northwest Indiana from Chicago at that time, or in 2017, I should say. And we bought this house that was like this 1970s time capsule of like green shag carpet and the wood paneling and the whole 9 yards. And so we were going to rehab it for us to move into. And it was right on Lake Michigan. And it had this unfinished walkout basement. And so I was like, in 2017, Airbnb wasn't what it was or what it is today. It's very new still, but I kept hearing about people who were doing this, and I was like, this short-term rental thing seems like it could make money, and it seems like we have the right components here. So I was like, what if we just, while we're rehabbing this, just turn this basement into a one-bedroom apartment and try it? What's the worst that can happen? It adds equity. You could use it as a long term if it doesn't work out. So it was very low risk. And we did that, and we listed it right before Memorial Day that year. And we ended up booking out every single day. Like, it was just back to back booking, like, that whole summer. And we made over $20,000 that summer on this dinky little one bedroom windowless apartment. And I had entire rental properties that didn't make that much in a whole year, these houses that I owned in the south suburbs of Chicago. And so I was like, there's something to this. And if we can figure out a way to kind of grow this and scale it, I think this could be really profitable. So that's how it started. And then it evolved into the fact that I didn't want to take on a ton of risk. I've always been risk averse. And so I started looking around areas where I thought this could potentially work, but they were still affordable areas. And there was a place near us. It's called Michigan City, Indiana. It's a town. It's a very working class town, old industrial town, right on Lake Michigan. But yet it still draws in tourism and stuff. And so I was looking at Airbnbs there, and I was like, even if I rented out the average house in this town 50% of the time, like all winter, it just sat vacant, it still makes more than it would make as a long-term rental. And so just tested it out there. And then the philosophy and methodology kind of grew from there.
Yeah. So a couple things that I'm hearing. And I love your story and your background because you were already in the real estate world, so to speak. You already took the training wheels off. And so you were able to have a different perspective and think outside the box a little bit. I think that's where so many I mean, this is just my opinion. People that I talk to all the time, they're so overwhelmed. There's so many ways to invest. I think it's all amazing. I think it's awesome to flip. I think it's awesome to wholesale. It's great to own short-term rentals. Obviously, I love long-term rentals. They're all great. But you need to start somewhere to get experience. And everybody, you said the word risk many times. Everybody's different risk adverse. Some people are like, hey, this doesn't have enough cash flow. To them, that's risky when there's not enough cash flow. Some people are like, hey, this is my risk level. I'm worried about tenants or I'm worried about whatever. Everybody has different risk levels. And so when you're analyzing a new short-term rental market, let's just call it a market or an area, or you're looking at a new property, what are those risks that you're looking at now versus you when you bought that first one in 2017?
Yeah. For me, I was always drawn to short-term rentals or vacation rentals. I always liked the idea of it. I think they're really cool. And it's like they obviously rent for a higher return because it's shorter period of time. So it always fundamentally made sense to me. But at the same time, I always think through what's the worst case scenario. And so to me, it was like, if I own this property and there's this total meltdown, or there's a regulation shift, or there's something like that where I can't use it for that purpose anymore, what are my options? And to me, it was always like, okay, I can either rent it as a long-term rental. And if it's a high-end, nice vacation rental, I'm going to hemorrhage thousands of dollars a month as a long-term rental. Or I could try to sell it when everybody else is trying to sell theirs because they're in the same situation, and it's probably going to get pennies on the dollar. So I couldn't figure out like a solution to that. And so that's why I think I delayed in getting into short-term rentals. But then I realized once we got into it that, I mean, there was a 500,000,000 bookings on Airbnb alone last year. So there's a lot more people booking these than just people on high-end vacations. People travel for work, they book it, they, go to a wedding, a funeral, visiting family. So all these utilitarian reasons, non-leisure travel reasons that people are booking. And so I realized that you can buy properties, especially in the Midwest, where there's a lot of multifamily stock. You can buy these small multi-unit properties that are really inexpensive properties just outside of massive populations of millions of people that still have a really high nightly rate and occupancy because there's millions of people there. And when there's millions of people, like, there's a lot of weddings, a lot of funerals, a lot of work travel. And so if you have multiple units in a really affordable property with really elevated income levels per unit, that translates to really high cash flow. So for me, like, when I'm evaluating a property, I came up with this 1% net rule of thumb because, most people know the 1% rule for long-term rentals that a lot of people talk about is like, does it rent for on a gross, is a gross rent on a monthly basis 1% of your purchase price? But that never made sense to me because expenses are always different in every property. And so all I cared about was the net that was left over at the end of the month. That's what I am going to feed my family based off of. So what I realized is with these small multi-units, we could get 1% net on a monthly basis of the purchase price. So if we're buying a $300,000 property, it's a 3 or 4 unit property, it might bring in $7,000 or $8,000 on a monthly basis as all short-term rentals. And then you subtract out $3,000 to $4,000 worth of expenses, and it has $3,000 of net cash flow left over, or 1% of the purchase price. And so that's our rule of thumb to know that our risk is always covered. If you hit 1% net, every single other metric is off the charts. And it's always commiserate with the purchase price because some people will say, I want $1,000 a month on a short term rental. Well, $1,000 a month on a $100,000 short term rental compared to $1,000,000 short term rental is a very different $1,000 a month. And so this keeps you in check compared to your purchase price.
That's such great advice, and that's a phenomenal rule. Yeah, the the 1% rule for long-term rentals, I mean, that those days are gone unless you're really willing to go
Yeah.
into a C-class neighborhood or something like that. So, I'm really glad that you brought that up. I literally run deals exactly like you do. I look at what is the worst case scenario, and I look at what are the options? So even if I'm looking at a short-term rental or a long-term rental, I look at all the options too. I look at a long-term rental in Memphis, and it's a great property, and we've got a long-term renter there, but I keep on thinking, I think that could be a really good short-term rental. And so I'm always like curiously go in and kind of run the numbers. So I think that's a great strategy for anybody to look at. And especially I love how you were talking about so many people assume that a short-term rental has to be a vacation area. And honestly, I'm second guessing some of the houses that I bought in vacation areas because it is really limited and there is a lot of competition. And I love the idea of going to these areas. Like you said, there's business people. People always think of the traveling nurses. That's like the one people always throw out first,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I actually had a client that bought a long-term rental in Memphis. It was right by an airport. And they ended up turning it into a midterm rental for pilots because it was just so close to the airport. And so thinking outside the box like that, like you said, there's weddings and there's funerals and there's business people and there's like, what are all the reasons why people are coming to these areas? And then going, okay, if I'm renting it as a short-term rental and that's my plan, awesome. But what's the worst case scenario? Can I turn it into a midterm rental? Can I turn it into a long-term rental? And I think you also struck on a point is you can go over the top a little bit high risk with luxury. I think that's the piece, and I'd love to get your opinion on that, is where are you seeing short-term rentals going right now that are the high-end luxury? Do you see those strong, or do you see those kind of wavering a little bit, or what are you seeing right now with those ones? Because that's kind of the ones that everybody, the gurus on TV or, on Instagram, social media, everybody's like the high-end luxury, the pickleball courts and the this and that and the 20 the 20 bedrooms, and what are you seeing
So
right now with those? And then to follow-up question to that is, what are you focusing on other than you kind of already told us, you're liking the small multifamilies? Is it kind of that what you were leaning towards?
yeah, yeah. So I guess to answer, yeah, the first question around the luxury Airbnbs, I think there's a place for those. If the goal is financial freedom, I don't think that's probably the best place to first start for that to maximize cash on cash return and cash flow. But if you just want to own an awesome property on the beach and have it kind of pay for itself, that can work. The challenge with those though is there's only so many people who are going to take a high-end vacation, right? There's only so many people that can afford that. And so as these areas have become more popular, like you said, it's like everybody is focused on this. You put in short-term rentals, how to buy short-term rentals or whatever on YouTube, and it's just people focused on these same markets. It's like the Smoky Mountains, the Destin Beach, Florida's, the Desert Oasis and Joshua Tree. It's like all these same markets just keep coming up over and over. And it's like those are the only markets that exist. And That's what a lot of people just assume. And so the problem is that in those markets, they've become so congested with short term rentals that everyone just has to one up each other to get that subset of renters that are just there for a high end vacation. Nobody's just like in town on work and just going to stay at your $1,000 a night cabin, luxury cabin in the woods. They're planning their vacation out 6 months in advance and booking that with a large group. And you have to like be able to capture that business. So it's not as forgiving, I guess. And there's a lot of those properties on the market now because I have conversations weekly with people who bought those, the $1 million cabin in the woods that the realtor sold them. This is going to be a great investment. Now they're losing money every month and it's costing them and they want to get rid of this thing. So if you compare that though to, we love the hybrid strategy. So if you buy a small multi-unit, say for 300,000, which I know in California, like that buys you a doghouse, but in the Midwest, that's like a real, like you can buy a turnkey $300,000 property in Michigan City where we're at, or like a lot of towns along the Rust Belt. That's a really nice property. And so if you bought that type of property, you can maximize the peak season. Like for us, that's summertime. People are going to Lake Michigan, going to the beach. There's wineries around. There's lots of stuff to do. We charge in some cases 5-6 times as much per night for these properties in the peak season. So we don't do any midterm rentals because we're going to be at 100% occupancy for a huge premium. But then in the off season, when it's slower and it's a lot of smaller groups traveling, we can rent out each individual unit to a guy who's in town working for the next 3 months on there's a lot of data centers being built, and there's a big steel mill nearby. There's a bunch of stuff that draws people in just as contracted workers, and you get 100% occupancy and maximize the revenue in the off season that way. So throughout the year, then it leads to just really strong cash flow. And I feel like those are just so much more resilient in a downturn. I could use it as a long-term rental tomorrow and it still cash flows, convert it, or I could convert it, just do midterm. There's a lot of different optionality. And then also there's so many different reasons that people are booking those compared to just luxury vacations.
I love that so much. We are so aligned. I am so I am so fearful for the people. Like my heart goes out to the people that are just hearing these stories of you're making $1 million on these short-term rentals, and like you said, like these really popular markets, and people go out and they put real money into them. And I mean, it costs money to set up an Airbnb. You're not only buying the property and they cost more, but you're also setting up everything, furnishing it and filling it and all the things. And then they don't know what they're doing and they're just trusting. And those are the people that I fear for the most. And that I'm like, hello, screaming from the rooftops, like, let's look at this. And number one is what do you have time for? Some people just don't have the time to really make a short-term rental successful. They think that someone else is just going to you're going to put it up on Airbnb and it's going to just magically do well. Or you're just going to throw it out at a property manager and they're just going to be so amazing that you're going to make all this money. But there is things that you need to know, and there are strategies that you have to put into place. And like you said, I love the strategy of know when your high seasons are, take advantage of those. And then in the off season, know what your other strategies are and figure that out. I mean, there's things that people have to they have to know. And it's not just these high-end luxury, $1 million properties in the Smokies. Like there's other options out there, you guys. So how would somebody listening right now who's like, yeah, I agree, I'm on that same type of risk level that we're talking about here, how would somebody look for one of these markets or these types of short-term rentals living thousands of miles away? I don't live in Indiana. I'm sure there's a million markets out there that are similar to what you're describing. How would somebody find those markets?
Yeah, and one actually additional point, because I agree with everything you just said. But the other thing to think about too is with these high end properties, I see $100,000 build outs all the time, to furnish the property, install the lap pool, the pickleball court, all that stuff depreciates. Like, they think they're buying this asset that's appreciating, and the asset itself is, but you're buying all these things that are like, they don't last that long. And like I said, other people are one upping you. So when the new technology comes out with the latest wave pool or lap pool that is better than yours, now what do? Like you just scrap the one that you have, or and if you try to sell it, like people are like, I don't really, I don't want that version. It's outdated, and so you're spending all this capital expenditures on things that are depreciating or going to become worthless in a few years in a lot of cases. Whereas with more affordable properties, like that expectation is not there, and so you can make a phenomenal property for a few $1,000s per room max, and it does really, really well without having to have like all the additional bells and whistles added on, and it still gets phenomenal reviews and all that. So just wanted to make that point because I think it's something that's not considered a lot of times as people are kind of weighing apples to apples. But to answer your question around picking the market, I always recommend to people to start with the part of the country that's on sale. So as you think about the country, like if you think about in cost per square foot, if you look at the coasts, typically it's a lot higher cost per square foot. Throughout the Midwest and Southeast, you see this whole swath where it's just the lowest purchase price compared to the square footage. And so I always try to overlay two maps. I overlay the cost per square foot, the average cost per square foot with the average population. And so you can find kind of in the Great Plains state really low cost per square foot, but like you can drive for miles and see one person. It's like there's nobody that lives there. It's not a great place to have a short-term rental. But if you overlay those maps, you'll see like obviously LA and New York have really high populations, but really high cost per square foot. But throughout the whole Rust Belt, where there was the whole industrial revolution happened, there's millions of people in these cities. And it's also super low cost per square foot. So because there's that population there again, like that's where a lot of travel happens, even if it's not vacation related. Some is vacation related, some isn't. And so start there and buy just outside of the cities that in towns that aren't controlled by the hotel lobbyists that have made it really restricted. In most large cities, it's just really hard to own short-term rentals, but just outside of that city, you get all the spillover demand because it's highly restricted in the city. But they're very welcoming in our town because they want more people to visit. And so they like short-term rentals. And then an hour away is Chicago, where it's like, you got to give a blood sample to be able to get a permit to do anything. And so it's night and day difference. So don't fight uphill. Go the easy route just outside, buy for a fraction of the cost of what it would be in the city, have lower regulations. You can rent out all the units instead of one per 4 units in Chicago. And the numbers just make a ton of sense.
There was something that you said that kind of triggered, I don't know, trauma response from me or something, but you said when we were talking about luxury Airbnbs, because I do own a couple that would be considered kind of more on the luxury end. And I'm curious, guests and guest reviews, expectations. I feel like some of the worst guests and the reviews have been reflective on properties that I think are my best, most beautiful high-end properties. And so my constant struggle is like, oh my gosh, this first of all, this is a hospitality business. It truly is. Like, I have to respond in a certain way when somebody messages me, I can't just be like, "Screw you," "Suck it
Yeah,
up,"
yeah,
like, I actually have to respond in a very, nice, kind way, but also people walk all over you, right? And so there's drawing that boundary of, like, being nice and being kind, but I kid you not, I got a one-star review recently, and for you guys listening, that is devastation. Like, that is like, "Oh my gosh, like, I wouldn't even let my worst enemy stay at the house, this is a crack house, this is like" you know what I mean? This is like and they were somebody from the city who came up to the mountains and they said they didn't appreciate the leaves on the outdoor furniture. They didn't find the views that enjoyable. I mean, it was ridiculous, but then also, yes, there was trash in the yard because an animal in the mountains had gotten into the trash and kind of spread it out everywhere and we didn't know about it because, I don't have a landscaper that shows up in the mountains every day. So anyway, so that was their idea of a one-star, like, horrific place to go. So it's expectations, right? It's like, I almost feel like the nicer the house, the harder it is to get guest approval and reviews. What are your thoughts and feelings on that?
100%. Yeah. I just released a video yesterday on my YouTube channel about this very thing because we've had well over 4,500 stays at this point and mostly all 5-star reviews. And then I pulled up some properties in more luxury areas like Scottsdale or Destin Beach or, some really nice cabins in the mountains. And these are phenomenal, like brand new build properties that somebody probably spent a year developing and like furnishing amazing. And they got like a 4.8 something review because they have some lower reviews. And it's like, I showed up and the pool temperature was, not as warm as I would have liked. So they give a 4 or 3-star review. Or to your point, like, yeah, like just any like the view, I couldn't see as far as I wanted to. Or, like the expectation is so high that you have to bend over backwards and make sure everything perfection is the expectation, as opposed to what we try to do is just make sure that the right person for that property is there. And so the way we do, like we have a property that's a 2-unit property right by railroad tracks and in a working class area. And so initially I thought this could never work as a short-term rental, but it works really. We have a 4.97-star rating after hundreds of reviews. People love the place. And there's people in the comments that say it's right next to a train track. You can hear the train really loud. But we say that in our listing. Like we tell people exactly what it is. This is a working class area, a very eclectic area. Some places need to be fixed up, some places are rehabbed. Right near a railroad track, you can hear the railroad. So if you're a light sleeper, don't book this place. Like that's how clear we are with who should be booking. So we don't get the person who is planning to show up to a, luxury place and be put out because the pool temperature is slightly off. Like we get the person who grew up in a working class area and that's totally fine with them. And that's what they wanted. Yeah. So you just want to match the, half billion guests that booked the right subsection of those with the right property and never surprise a guest. But the expectation is much higher in luxury properties, obviously.
Yeah, that is such great advice. Yeah, I have a cabin that it's 100 years old. So it was built in 1925. And I literally say that. I go, "Look, if you don't like," and I kinda said it in a kind of a funny way, I was trying to be,
Yeah.
like, kind of clever about it, but also very serious. I was like, "If you don't like creaky floorboards and if you know
Yeah.
what I mean? And, like, nothing is straight in that house, it is settled, and you can see the soot on the fireplace." Like, I'm like, if you, don't appreciate that or you don't like the quirkiness or the history or whatever, I'm like, then this might not be the place for you. But welcome if you like the creaky, floorboards and the drafts that come in through the window, because that's the charm. There is a person for that, but you have to weed out the the sour grapes on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. We have one in our barn right here, actually. So we live on a farm in Indiana and we rent out a barn B&B. It has 226 all 5-star reviews, which is a pretty hard bar to maintain. I know eventually, like, you can't please everybody. So we're going to get a 4-star at least sometime. But like, it's a barn. Like, people are literally sleeping in a barn and there's roosters right outside. And people will mention that. They're like, the roosters are pretty loud in the morning, but I chose to come stay on a farm and they were very clear this is the whole farm experience. And so, yeah, it's just getting that right person who wants the roosters and not the guy who's like a light sleeper and hates the farm experience.
well, and I think, we're talking about a really important thing to like pull out and like address is when you want to invest in real estate, I think people have to really think about what it is they're doing and what do they want? Why are they buying this? Why do they want to do this? If you're a person that's like, "Hey, I want to be totally hands off. I don't want my phone attached to me. I don't want to deal with anything." It doesn't mean you can't buy short-term rentals. It just means you're probably going to have to hire a property manager. Like, let's set that expectation. Or maybe you should do long-term rentals. We're also looking at budgets and money. Sometimes people are like, I only want to invest in my own backyard where I live, whether it's short term or long term. What is your budget? You might not have enough money to do that. You might have to look
Yeah.
outside of your area and outside of your state. And also, what are your expectations? Like we're sitting here talking about is like who is the guest that you want to host. If you were to buy a short-term rental, I have found personally that most people that I've worked with or myself, it's me. I'm my guest avatar. Usually, it's like, what kind of a place do I want to go to? Or what kind of a place do I want to be at with my family? And I tend to book those places, but then I also tend to curate those places for me. And so I think everybody needs to think about that. Maybe you are a busy professional who travels and you're like, hey, there's an opportunity. Maybe I need to curate or get a place that is for me, the guest avatar for what I'm doing. And, you live on a farm and you have a barn. I wouldn't know the next thing about having an Airbnb in a barn. I wouldn't curate that. I wouldn't look for it. I wouldn't buy it because it isn't me. I don't know anything about it. I wouldn't even know how to respond to a guest if they're like, hey, there's a rooster. You know what I mean? I would just be like, I don't even know what a rooster does. What is their purpose in life? You know what I mean? So I feel like
Very true.
we
Yeah,
need to lean
absolutely.
into what our comfort zone is and what we want. And for you guys listening, if you're like, "Hey, I love the luxury." Awesome. That is great. If you want to own a luxury apartment, I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I'm just saying there is benefits and there's pros and cons to everything here and every style of real estate investing and every top opportunity out there. And I think it's best to figure out, really think about it. Close your eyes and envision and imagine, why are you investing in real estate and what does that look like to you? So what do you think about all that?
Oh, totally. Yes, and that's why I love real estate so much is because there's a path for just about every single person, and you can customize it, and there's not, I think the scary thing and the overwhelming thing for most people getting started is they see a TikTok and they're like, "This is the only way to make money, and everyone else is stupid," and it's just not true. It's you really the key is just to understand yourself and understand what makes you comfortable, what you enjoy doing, and you can customize real estate for exactly that. So I think that's excellent advice.
Well, I keep going back to, I think your biggest takeaway is when you were talking about looking at all sides of things. So, for those of you who are listening who maybe you own a long-term rental, maybe you should consider running the numbers. Learn a little bit about, what would this look like if I turned this property into a midterm rental or a short-term rental. Do some research, reach out to Kirby, go to his website, listen to his podcast. Maybe you can figure out if maybe that is the next move for you. You don't have to go out and buy a new property. Maybe you already have the property. Maybe you own it. Maybe maybe you own a short-term rental and you're like, "Oh, this is not it for me." It doesn't mean short-term rentals are bad. It means maybe you need to release that asset. Maybe you need to move on from that one and go to a different strategy. So I think that's more, I mean, I think that's the important piece that you've opened up my eyes to is, it doesn't have to be a luxury vacation destination. It doesn't have to be the Disney World. It doesn't have to be the Joshua trees or whatever. There's opportunities out there.
Yeah, and then once you do, I think there is something to be said about, building economies of scale and building systems around it. So once I'd say test lots of different strategies, try different things when you're first getting started, and then build a system like you have to where it's like kind of packaged and you can just replicate that process over and over again. So, yeah, I think that's great advice.
Well, and also, I know it gets really overwhelming for people to plug in and hear you and I talking where we are now. We have done a lot. We've had a lot of experience. We've renovated houses. We've done it. I feel like we've kind of done a lot, and it can be very overwhelming to see us talking about it, or you see the people on TV, and people think that, oh, I need to do that. I need to be there right now. But everybody has to start somewhere. And my early days of this, I did not go out and just buy an expensive property and figure it out on my own. I mean, I bought a cheap property that I thought was low risk, and I had help and I had assistance and I had people that were telling me and guiding me what to do. And I got my feet wet and I learned and I got confident and I made mistakes along the way. I've had really good successes along the way, but I didn't give up. I just kept on going and I'm like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to figure out a better system. I'm going to figure out a better plan. Now I'm going to try short-term rentals and now I'm going to try, I've wholesaled. I accidentally learned how to do that, I guess. You know what I mean? But like, I wouldn't have done those had I not gotten started somewhere at the place where I was at in the moment. And everybody's at a different place. Sometimes we have more money than time, and sometimes we have more time than money. So, what is your advice for everybody listening today? Where is the best place to start if they are thinking about, hey, maybe this short term rental thing makes sense for me? Where should they start?
I can tell you the turning point for me around what exactly what you're talking about. When I first started, with the flipping company, I did it because it was kind of like I had no clear outcome in mind of what financial freedom or what it was that I was trying to get out of this. It was more of just like listening to people talk about success in terms of, a lot of times it's just material things and like accumulation of stuff. And so just kind of pursuing quote unquote success in general of just more money and more of everything. And then it was like after we got married was kind of the turning point when all of a sudden, my wife and I were starting to plan together. And this was in 2016. And we started to envision what we wanted our actual life to look like 10 years from now. Like, and if we were living our perfect days, like what do those days consist of? And I realized it didn't actually require nearly as much as I thought it did. I didn't have to be a deca millionaire to make my perfect day work, and so then we had a clear place to backwards plan from, and then we could pick the strategy that allowed us to get to that place. And so many people just skip that step. And I ask people all the time, like, okay, so what's your goal in getting into this? And it's like, well, I just want more so that I can do more deals and then I can, eventually get into buying businesses and then, private equity. And then, and it's like, eventually do more and more, and it's like, so then what? So then eventually you're going to be happy, or what does that look like? And so I would say the first step is to define your ideal days and what that looks like. And if you were living your ideal days, like, how would that feel? What would you do? Like, where would you be living? And then you can backwards plan and you can't make decisions until you have that clear. And so then once you start backwards planning, decision making becomes so much easier. So I'd say that's the first step. And then if short-term rentals or my strategy appeals to you, you can go to livingoffrentals.com/start. And I've got a whole web class that I did there that really outlines my whole methodology, shows example deals, all the numbers, like everything you need to know. So you can check that out.
Amazing. I was just gonna ask you, where can people find you? Where can they hear
Yeah.
about you? So you put that in, and you guys, I'm also gonna put a link in the show notes, but thank you so much. I'm not even gonna add to that because I think that was such a beautiful ending. I love, love, love that story so much, and I think you're absolutely right. That is the piece that people miss. So I'm not even gonna mess up and try to rephrase everything you said because it was absolutely perfect. So I think that's a perfect, perfect place for us to end. So thank you again. And you guys don't forget to check out the show notes to reach out to Kirby. And thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Melissa.